So I wanted to surprise you. We're just going to read the entire book. Starting at page 1. So we'll be here for about 14 hours.
It did. I read the audiobook for it, and it is like cumulatively like 12 hours, 10 to 12 hours. It took so long.
Well, I was going to say, like, the whole process must have taken like
yeah,
weeks.
It's like 3 times that. So this is top of mind because I'm in the process of editing the second book right now, and so I actually sort of thought through how many hours I will have, like, by the time my second one gets published, there probably the math estimate wise, and it's going to turn out to be roughly the same timeline as the first one. It's going to be about 200 hours poured in to make this thing.
For the second one, for the audiobook, or just
no, that's like
writing it.
Yeah.
And you're just sticking with when you're writing a book, I feel like you could say you're going to do 200 hours, but it's going to take longer.
Yeah,
you're like, at 200, I'm done. If it's finished or not.
No, 100%. I'm just like, if you figure, like, well, I guess it'll probably actually be more than that. It'll be way more than that.
I was gonna say 200 hours does not seem like a lot for, depending on what you're writing.
200 hours is like just the editing process. Is like, so that's not the first draft. Gotcha. So that's like, as I'm going through this editing process, and I was like figuring out how much time. Like it takes me like, honestly, it takes about an hour a page, which is,
God bless you,
wild.
Jordan Peterson, have you read Maps of Meaning by Jordan?
I have.
Really? Okay. I haven't read it. But someone told me he went over every single sentence in that book and rewrote like every single sentence at least a couple times.
I think that book took him something like 10 to 15 years. I mean, so it's
dense too. It's almost 500 pages, I think.
Yeah, it's a lot of pages. My second book actually draws a decent amount of inspiration from Maps of Meaning.
Oh, cool.
Because that Maps of Meaning is very influenced by Origins and History of Consciousness. It's just opposite. History and Origins of Consciousness by this guy named Erich Neumann, who was like a student of Carl Jung.
He's got a book I have sitting in my living room. And it's Erich Neumann.
Yeah.
It's like the History of Consciousness or something like that.
That's what I just said.
Yeah.
History and Origins of Consciousness.
Okay, I haven't read it though.
Yeah. No, but so functionally it's all about, Joseph Campbell also was very influenced by Jung. And so Neumann does a fantastic job. At the very beginning of the book, Jung writes a prelude or an introduction, and he effectively says, this is the book I wish I would have written. Of course, he couldn't have written it because he needed to lay the groundwork in order for a student to then be able to come in and be like, oh, this is a synthesis of these. Honestly, like, writing through that portion, what those guys are talking about and what Jordan Peterson is talking about on Maps of Meaning, I've never felt like the amount of brain power. I'm not kidding you when I say it's as exhausting as like a very heavy deadlift. Like the amount of energy to process, comprehend, and then try to like synthesize, analyze the deepest concepts of all time, in my opinion, is like taking every ounce of brain power I possess. It like just writing it feels like this interplay of my mind. It's like I can like feel my mind like disintegrating and then reintegrating as I'm writing, and it's like this process of like bursting into atoms and then coming back in sort of a more integrated whole, stronger brain. But it's hard, like when I'm in the process of writing it, during those times specifically, I'll have 2 hours of very focused attention because it requires everything. Like,
Do you do anything before?
no,
You just like, you don't prep or get into some kind of mind state before you get into that?
no,
No. Okay.
no. I just because it's like the first thing I do in the morning.
Okay.
So I'll, wake up, have some electrolytes,
hmm
maybe do like walk around a little bit, let
Gotcha.
myself wake up a little bit, but then
Yeah.
I'll sit down and write. And man, it's been hard for me, honestly, like the last month or so. The editing process specifically requires so much of me, and trying to distill basically like the core ideas of maps and meaning into 50 pages,
Mm.
because that's just a very small part of my book,
Yeah.
is like, I'm not joking when I said it's the hardest thing I've ever tried to do. And it just leaves me, my brain is just torched the rest of the
Yeah.
day. Like it's hard for me to even like focus or have conversations because I've used every ounce of fuel, like brain fuel, to try to do this thing. I mean, I'm sure there's science behind this, and I've heard people mention something along the lines or sort of around this idea of 3 hours of hard thinking is like, in terms of
Yeah.
the toll it takes, is very, it's like the equivalent of a very hard workout.
Deadlift.
And so I've been in a weird space lately the last few months of like trying to do that in the mornings, and then it's just like, then I got to try to find motivation to go work out around noon. And it's like, by the time I do those two things, I'm like, I can't even hardly have a conversation with somebody because I'm just like, yeah,
You're like kind of
I'm in space. It's
interesting.
wild.
And it seems like your goal is to write a book per year.
Yeah.
That's a difficult goal, it seems to me, at least. But
it's
a lot of preparation and scheduling, it seems.
yeah, these first two books for me, especially, I know that you read a good chunk of the first book. They're pretty heavy in research.
This way to the star.
Yeah, yeah, I appreciate that. And so it's a kind of a different. There are different types of writing. Obviously there's fiction and nonfiction, but even within nonfiction, I would say mine kind of falls in this category of almost like historical nonfiction. And so the hardest part is just, I mean, it's a skill I learned in law school, but the research, it's just the amount of research it takes. And because there's always a book you haven't read, or there's always something you don't know. And that's the hardest part, is the ability to say, okay, this is finished enough, understanding that you could research for infinity and not know all of the things you want to know. And that's honestly one of the hardest parts, is knowing when to be like, okay.
Yeah, this reminds me of this book I recently finished. It's called Chaos by Tom O'Neill. Highly recommend if you're into this. It's called Chaos, and the subtitle of the book is, I think, The Manson Murders, or Charles Manson, the 60s and the CIA.
That's a nice title.
Yeah, it's wild. It's a wild book. It essentially disproves certain facts that occurred during the trial that Vincent Bugliosi, the main prosecutor, wrote in his book, Helter Skelter. That's the most infamous book that we've had on the topic. And Tom O'Neill came out with this book in like just before 2020 and went on Rogan. He initially planned on writing a journalistic article that would take like 3 months. And he researched for, it was either 10 or 20 years.
Yeah.
And he couldn't stop because he just kept finding these like little bits of food down this like rabbit hole of what was happening. And he would just find Manson was in every prison that he went to was a federal prison, and he would be released every single time, over and over and over. And there was just certain ties to him being involved with federal agencies. And I'm not going to give away the book, but it was awesome. My dad's always been into like Stephen King, like thriller, horror fiction books, but also like nonfiction topics like that. My dad has Helter Skelter. He had it in our attic, and I was like, "You gotta fucking read this book because this just like literally disproves." And Vincent Bugliosi is in this book. Tom O'Neill talks about the conversations that he has, and Vincent like threatens him multiple times because his reputation would be so damaged.
Yeah.
Eventually, well, I don't want to. Yeah, I don't want to get. I don't want to. But it's so wild to think of what actually happened potentially right on the cusp of the 70s. Well, so it was in 69, and how it changed Hollywood and California, and just like that moment in history in America was just crazy to me. You've just got the Vietnam War, you've got the Manson murders, you've got the what is it, the the hippie movement, and so that's such a fascinating time in my opinion, and I wanted to do some more digging on that. Anyways, we're kind of going off a totally different topic.
No. I mean, so like that's like relatively recent history.
Yeah.
Right.
So you're doing thousands
so
of
like
years.
Yeah, multiply the difficulty in discerning the truth from relatively recent history to things that have been lost to obscurity.
Right.
And so that's where it's like everybody's got an angle or a different opinion on something that was said, and a different translation of something that was said 4,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. And so trying to figure out, one, what these people actually said, what they were trying to say, the context within which they lived, that's where it's like, you get caught chasing your tail, because it's like, how do you have any sort of opinion or make any sort of factual statement about what this person said or what they thought? It gets really hard. Like, I have no doubt somebody could take a very opposite stance of the things I wrote in my book. And like, I don't really have a way of being like, no, you know what I mean? Like validating my opinion versus theirs, because it's been so long. Like, the best you can do is like do the research, understand sort of some of the various opinions, recognize some of those, like, hey, this is what I'm stating, but then I'm going to drop a footnote here that says there's also this train of thought that thinks this thing. Yeah. And so it just you constantly have to be aware of that when you're writing a book that tries to touch on anything ancient. Otherwise, it's like you run in pretty quickly to this territory of, man, none of what I'm saying could all be wrong.
Yeah.
It's wild. It's a crazy experience.
Yeah, I feel like that kind of would drive me crazy.
Oh, it does. It absolutely drives me crazy. It drives me nuts. That's what makes it so hard.
Yeah, it's a noble position to put yourself into, to just like, but it's a fascinating journey to just go down into the minds and the writings of these unbelievable philosophers.
Well, and what I tried to do, like, I didn't really realize this when I was writing it, but I effectively, the only way I could do it, given what I just said about the difficulty in discerning through the opaque layers of history that have obscured what these people said and their texts, or like Socrates didn't even write anything down. Like, everything we have is from Plato, and who's to say that Plato accurately portrayed him? Probably didn't, right? And so the only way to do it in a way that worked is effectively just invite the reader along to take like this journey, my own personal journey of like, hey, this is how I move through these texts and how it all made sense and like how it all fit together for me. With the idea of, I tried to stay a high enough level. It gets really hard when you're talking about complex ideas, but I tried to stay high enough and abstract enough to where it was sort of more of an introduction to the ideas, and kind of just like introduce them and be like, hey, if this resonates with you, like, please go visit the source text yourself and come to your own conclusion. I'm just giving you an example in my book of how one goes about synthesizing all of these ideas to know their own origin story. Because for as much as I'm trying to give an introduction to philosophy in there, ultimately, like the endeavor, the journey, the enterprise is it's almost like a mirror reflecting my journey of self-knowledge. And like, this is the process I went through is writing this book.
Yeah.
And that's why I talk about the reward is the work, like that, this idea that
The process.
that, exactly. It's the act of writing that, whether or not anybody else read it. Like at the end of the day, I didn't realize it until after it was out, but it was like ultimately what I would love, for as much as I would love everybody to learn about the concepts in there, what I want them to take away more is this invitation to self-exploration.
Mm-hmm.
That the writing the book was that vehicle for me in terms of like learning more about myself. And I just think, at the end of the day, I think we're all on this excavation project where, you think about it like the iceberg, like the conscious and unconscious. It's kind of the same thing. I like the visual of ruins, and like, I always wanted to be an archaeologist when I was younger. That was like the first. So a lot of people want to be like pro athletes.
Yeah.
I wanted my mom to like send me to archaeology camp.
Cool.
And so I've always loved that visual of like on your hands and knees, sort of dusting ruins and sort of like press.
You're kind of doing that.
Yeah, exactly.
Right now.
Exactly. So that's why I love writing about what I'm writing on, is because I sort of see myself as excavating ruins, but in the literary world, instead of doing it literally, I'm doing it sort of metaphorically.
Yeah, I really enjoyed how you put it in chronological order from the beginning of mankind, and just went, and there's so much to dissect. You could write a whole book on Seneca. You could write a whole
100%.
book on one of the philosophers. But
People have.
Yeah. But I like how you were able to do it in chronological order and give context to culture, the times during that philosopher's range in which they lived. But the biggest thing too, what really I took away, was how you're able to take each philosopher, provide a hint of the most important ways of thinking and what they contributed to, and then kind of put that in a modern day version. Like there's one, you could probably do this in any period of time, but it was, I think maybe Seneca, or I'm trying to remember which philosopher it was, and you were able to put an excerpt of what you would say if you were speaking to, if Seneca was speaking to you, I believe.
It was Marcus Aurelius.
Marcus, okay.
Yeah, it was the section of kind of when it's like, I think it was in the bonus time section when he sort of talks about this idea of Donald Robertson in How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, included at the very end of his book. It was almost this like meditative experience, and he did it as Marcus on his deathbed. And
Marcus, so that guy was on his deathbed speaking to Marcus, or Marcus?
No. So Donald wrote it from Marcus's perspective, as if it was, he put himself in the place of Marcus on his deathbed.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So
you want to find it?
So what I found, I think I got a spot here. It is, I believe, Socrates, actually.
Oh, interesting.
So
the very end of the Socrates section of like
yes.
Your souls in your keeping alone.
Yes.
Where it talks about like when the world says
yeah.
move.
So
yeah.
I do know that when I consult his spirit inside me, I receive an answer that sounds a little something like this. It doesn't matter what the press, politicians, other people say. It doesn't matter what professional or parental pressures are placed on you or what the mass of men say. It doesn't matter if the whole world decides something wrong is something right. Keeping your soul requires that you speak the truth always, even if it leads to your death. It requires that you stand up for what is right, no matter the odds or consequences. So when the world tells you to do something about which you have sincere objections or tries to silence you with shame, your job is to plant yourself firm and send your roots deep, drawing strength from the reservoir of truth and responding no, because your soul is in your keeping alone. I loved that. I read that over like multiple times, because I feel like we're in this time in human history, or at least in modern day history, where there's, at least from my personal perspective, when I'm in, like, cause I'm kind of specialized in Bitcoin. And so when I go on social media to learn about Bitcoin, that also trickles in press and potential propaganda and politicians or politics. And I've had to battle that over the course of the past year, using the internet as a tool of finding knowledge, because it's been very helpful in that regard. But then also there's this trickling of negative news and certain things that you should be following. And this message that you wrote really stuck with me in the book, and I'm curious as to how you kind of stick to your own what you believe, or how you, like, the process of how you find what is right in your soul, regardless if people around you are telling you that something is wrong.
Yeah. That it's always funny. That was probably one of the most meaningful parts of the book for me to write. Specifically, like, if you think about the timing of me writing this, it's like the height of COVID stuff.
Oh, okay.
And so this was like a lot of that process, or like writing this book was as I navigate this tough situation.
Yeah.
And like a lot of the world was just crazy. And a lot of things were being asked of people. And it was like one of those things where I actually had to, like, it was the process of trying to think intentionally about what would the greatest thinkers, philosophers, wisest people of all time, like, tell me in this moment. And I kept coming back to, like, it was like Socrates and Boethius were the two, like, I spent the most time with, where in my imagination, in the same way that Lady Philosophy visits Boethius in prison, I would be in bed, like, on a, like, would a sleepless night. And I remember I wrote a journal entry imagining Boethius's spirit, like, coming in and, like, just having a chat with me when, like, one of the nights that I couldn't sleep. And that's what it looks like to me. So Socrates, one of my favorite parts of Socrates, in when Plato tells the story of his trial, the trial of Socrates, Socrates delivers this monologue in front of the Senate, where he says, listen, I have the daemon. He's like, I have this spirit that I consult on everything. And when it tells me not to do something, I don't do that thing. And so, like, when his friends were trying to bust him out of prison before he was about to go to his trial and get executed, and the reason he didn't is he's like, I consulted my daemon and it didn't object to me going before the Senate and standing up for, ultimately he was trying to stand up for Athens. He was trying to preserve Athens because he saw sort of some of the corruption that was happening. And, he got accused of impiety and corrupting the youth just for simply questioning the status quo. And you see that time and time again with the various philosophers, is how many of them get put to death for standing up for the truth.
Seems like a trend.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And so in that same way where Socrates would talk about consulting sort of the daemon, the inner spirit, I mean, for me, what it looks like is it doesn't take very long for you to just, like, when you're sitting in silence, if you have something you're contemplating or thinking about, you could use COVID as an example of, like, if there's a regulation or a mandate that you disagree with, if you truly just sit with yourself and there's something in you that it objects to this thing, be like, this something here just doesn't feel right. Then it's like, you honor that. Like, if there's something in you that objects to it, and, of course, sometimes
you could be wrong.
You could be wrong. And sometimes it could be programming, right? Like, of course, those are things. But you have to at least respect it enough to when you have an objection, when something in you, like some voice, whether it's your conscience, doesn't matter. When it speaks up and says, wait a second,
Mm-hmm.
like don't at least honor it enough to not rush into making a decision and like actually think about what you think and what you stand for. And so for me, the process, what that looks like is just like, it takes, if, you know, it's usually something like, it doesn't come clearly necessarily. So it's like, you kind of feel something, feel an objection, you sit with yourself and it says something to you and you're like, oh, you know, maybe I shouldn't do this, or maybe I don't think this is right, or even though this is the easy decision, maybe it means I have to leave my job. And the instinct when an uncomfortable, so I'll give an example, like from that exact thing happened to me, and so I left my old law firm
Because
of some of the COVID stances.
yeah, I'm kind of in a similar situation.
Yeah.
Or I was. Yeah.
Yeah. And so for me, it was like, it would have been, at that point, there was still sort of like nobody knew what was happening. But all I knew at that point was I knew enough that a piece of me had an objection. And so I was like, you know, it would be very easy for me to just kind of just like do what my firm wants me to do. And, you know,
There's security.
life would be, like,
Yeah.
it would be easier. It would just make life easier.
Maintain your job.
But then I would consult the Socrates and Boethius in me, and I was like, but what does that do to my soul? And it's like, Douglas Murray talks about it, and I can't remember what book this is in, but he kind of makes this reference to, I can't remember if it's Soviet Russia or Nazi Germany, but there's something about the citizens had to hang a certain, you know, thing in their window. It was like a flag or something. And it was like, it was always a reminder to them of their obedience, like their subservience, like the fact that, you know, they had bent the knee to this thing that they had objections about. And it was like, I couldn't live with myself.
Same. Yeah. I mean, we don't have to get too far into COVID, but I was in a similar situation. I lost my job. I was in restaurant operations and we were all let go. I mean, once April kicked in, Boston mayor or the governor of Boston stated that they were closing down pretty much all restaurants in the city of Boston. But I think also eventually he said in the state of Massachusetts, they were shutting everything down. And that was like, holy shit. And he said it was going to happen for 3 weeks. It eventually lasted for a year or so. But I then came to a moment where I had time to just reflect on everything that was happening. I had no job. I went back home with my family because it was concerning about the virus. And luckily at the time, prior to the pandemic, and, you know, initially starting, I had actually done a lot of work on myself. I took a lot of patience with, you know, just leaving a job that didn't like feel right prior to moving back to Massachusetts, and a relationship that I had, and I was meditating and reading and journaling and reflecting on my past and why I had certain fears and whatever. So I had gotten to this point where I molded and kind of shaped my mind and to an extent where I did have this intuitive feeling during COVID that something didn't feel right in regards to certain mandates or regulations or pushing upon people to do certain things. And unfortunately, it did cause a lot of arguments between family members and friends. And I've lost a friend. I've kind of had a obstruction of a relationship like within my family. And, but I think it's interesting to be able to have the courage. It seems like you were able to to have an intuitive feeling and stick with that, which requires courage, and to not just kind of follow the flow, the flock of sheep in regards to like just, you know, going with what your law firm is telling you. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's important to, if you think that something doesn't feel right, then you should question it. And yeah, for me, it was tough because during COVID, it was just really, you know, it seemed like you were selfish if you didn't do a certain thing. And
yeah, I mean, dude, it was one of those things that like it tore me up inside.
Oh, it did for me as well.
And I think it was easy for a lot of people, yeah, to be like see it as a selfish decision without understanding that like it if you're somebody that has sort of you know, is it generally an empathetic person and wants to be a good person and wants to be kind, the most hurtful thing people can do is obviously like call you selfish,
Right.
and that you're not a kind person and you're not a good person. And it's like I just, one of the things I'm a huge fan of Harry Potter.
Same.
And Sectum Sempra, in the Prisoner of Azkaban, right, is what Harry doesn't understand, like exactly the harm that these words can cause, and he uses them on Malfoy, and he almost kills him, right? And so like we see the same thing happen in life. It's like J.K. Rowling has the quote about words are most inexhaustible source of magic capable of hurting or healing, basically, inflicting injury or remedying it. And like, I mean, I think we saw that happen with COVID, where it's the power of words to do more damage than you realize when you wield them carelessly and not carefully. Like that was the thing that just like the amount of internal anguish where it was like just this, it was, I mean, there were like lacerate. It was as if, you know, society had Sectum Sempra and they were just like throwing it at everybody. Right. Like it, and it's this, it's, you know, it has the same effect of like when you carelessly call somebody a Nazi, you know what I mean? Or, I don't know, any other slur where,
Trump supporter, whatever.
Yeah. It doesn't matter what it is. It's just like understanding that words have consequences. And so it was hard. I mean, one of the hardest things in the world is to like be somebody. I'm sure Jordan Peterson would say the same thing of like all the nasty things that have been said about him. Or Joe Rogan. It doesn't matter. Like to sit and absorb sort of when people say those things and still find some source of conviction within yourself, even when they're tearing you apart, is like, to this day, like one of the hardest things in the world. And Seneca has a saying about a thing like that could not stand unless propped up by the divine. And so I like that same idea of, if I hadn't been writing this book, going through all that, I don't know that I would have had the strength to like stand in my convictions.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, for me, it was like going down this route of just analyzing my beliefs. So, as you know, I'm really into Bitcoin. We were just talking with the Meat Mafia guys.
Yeah.
Bitcoin beef and
Backstreet Boys.
Backstreet Boys. That's what it was. And I kind of, I started to observe how just prior to COVID too, I mean, Trump had really enraged society in America. And I just felt like during Trump's era, his presidential term, I'm 29 now. I was like 25, 24, 25. So it was like getting out of college, becoming an adult and observing society. And to me, it was just so clear. I was like, everybody is so polarized.
Yeah.
and emotionally just triggered, and it just didn't feel like how things used to be in regards to even like years prior when you were a teenager. Politics didn't really consume people's lives as much. And so once that, it just seemed like there was this gradual just transformation of polarization between whether you were for or against Trump, and then also, are you vaxxed or you're not vaxxed?
Yeah.
It was crazy to me. And so it was a huge test for me. It did eat me up as well. I was really trying to reflect on like, am I getting the right information?
Yeah.
Am I being selfish? Am I trying to just be ignorant, or not ignorant, but arrogant? And I was like, listen, I'll admit if I'm wrong. And I think that's something that everybody should accept. Like, when you know you're wrong, accept it. And I think that you just follow your intuition. That's what seems to be the best guide for me, is like, if you have that
Yeah.
intuition and you're not able to maybe like formally and clearly have a conviction in that moment, you go with your intuition and what seems to be, you know,
Yeah.
what's happening inside of you internally. And then if you're wrong, you admit it. And
Yeah. I mean, so that's another thing. Like, it's funny. I will forever look at this book and know the context I wrote it in, because it's going to be a snapshot of the point. Like, it's going to be very obvious to me what I was struggling with as I was writing it, because there's a later philosopher, Kant, Immanuel Kant. He has a categorical imperative. And so as human beings, as a feature of us as humans, we're very self-deceptive. And so we have a remarkable way of convincing ourselves of certain things, of having our own biases. We can never remove ourselves from our own biases. And so there's always this illusion aspect of, we'll justify. If we do something, we'll find a way to justify it. So I was like, okay, well, if that's a feature of being human and I can't ever remove myself from it completely, what are certain things I can do to at least keep me in, it's like the bumpers in bowling. Sort of keep the guidelines and guardrails to make sure, okay, am I being like, how do I introduce some sort of objectivity to my subjective thoughts so I can identify when I'm like, I've gone off the rails? Kant has the idea of the categorical imperative, which says, if your specific action, in order for it to be moral, it has to be scalable. So like, everybody has to be able to act the way you're about to act. If it's something, otherwise you're just making an exception for yourself. If it's not something that you would have everybody, he basically says like, he goes so far as to say that the way you are about to act becomes sort of maxim, like universal maxim. And so whatever you're going to do, imagine everybody does that thing. Are you still okay with it? If not, you're deceiving yourself. You're making an exception for yourself. It's rules for thee, but not for me situation. And so that's a fantastic filter for politicians, right? Is like, okay, this is a thing you're about to do. If everybody did it, would you still be okay with it? If not, probably should reconsider it. And so when I applied that, in the COVID situation, it was like, the answer to that was yes. So I was like, okay, I not only would I be okay with everybody making this decision, I actually want everybody to make this decision. And so that you have to find certain ways, and obviously the thing that I think was partially the most hurtful was the inability of people with differing opinions to talk to each other in a way where you could still respect the different decision. And like recognize, this is where it gets into the John Stuart Mill, who's another Enlightenment thinker, wrote All Minus One, and he kind of goes through how functionally, basically, his argument is it's for free speech, and how it's crazy. Like once you see through the filter of the time period that I wrote all this stuff in. But his argument, he recognized in like the 1600s, and he was saying free speech needs protection not just from government, but from sort of public oppression and public tyranny
The
too.
mob.
Exactly. And so he's like, listen, he who knows only his all minus one means, he's like, even if all of society held an opinion except for one person, like you wouldn't be justified in suppressing that one person's opinion. And he's like, one, because there are a few different arguments he makes. One is by suppressing an opposing opinion, you rob somebody the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. That's one. Two is he who knows only his side of the story knows little of it, or like, his side of it. And then three, he's like, even if they are wrong, them holding that opinion makes sure that the opinion you hold remains a living truth and not dead dogma. And so you're required to strengthen your position, and it's required to be solid and sound if you are forced to defend it against opposition. And so his whole point was around why we need opposing opinions to make us sharper and to make sure that constantly test our opinions against something else, honestly.
Yeah.
And I think that that's losing.
I agree.
It's fallen out of favor.
I agree. So a part of my journey throughout the pandemic, I mentioned Bitcoin. I had, prior to Bitcoin, gone through Jonathan Haidt. I don't know if you ever heard of him.
Yeah, Jonathan Haidt. So he's how I know about all minus one from John Stuart Mill.
Whoa.
Yeah, he produced through Heterodox Academy. If you literally type in all minus one, he has an illustrated PDF of some of the major excerpts from Mill's essay.
Yeah, so I first read his book, The Happiness Hypothesis, and then I think it's called
Coddling of the American Mind.
Yep, and then there's also The Righteous Mind, which kind of talks about human history, politics, just psychology, the human mind, intuition, rationality. And so I read his book in The Coddling of the American Mind. And the reason why I bring that up is because I was seeing the evolution of emotional intelligence going down within college students and younger generations, which is most likely the cause of people not being able to have disagreements and debates and whatnot. And I'm seeing that combination of a society becoming less able to have these disagreements in a way that still is respectful. Now, I think that's a combination of advancement in technology, social media. I also watched The Social Dilemma around the same time, and seeing how centralized algorithms could be manipulated and controlled by a small group of people. And so this kind of brings me to a section it's right in the beginning of your book. You mentioned Winston Churchill.
Yeah.
One of his excerpts, The 50 Years Hence.
Yeah.
I really like this.
So do I.
This is a super awesome part. I actually, sadly, I haven't done a lot of research and diving into Winston, but there's one section. I'll just quickly verbalize it.
Please.
We have the spectacle of the powers and weapons of man far outstripping the march of his intelligence. We have the march of his intelligence proceeding far more rapidly than the development of his nobility. We may well find ourselves in the presence of the strength of civilization without its mercy. It is therefore, above all things, important that the moral philosophy and spiritual conceptions of men and nations should hold their own amid these formidable scientific evolutions. There's also, it's pretty long.
Yeah,
I could read the whole thing, but there's another part that's kind of italicized. Without an equal growth of mercy, pity, peace, and love, science herself may destroy all that makes human life majestic and tolerable. Now, since I've been in Bitcoin and learning about technology, I recently was looking at Nostr, Nostr,
Yeah.
decentralized media or social media. But just in general, AI, me and Yash were having a conversation about this, and just the advancement of technology seems to be exponentially increasing at a faster and faster degree. And so Winston's message here really hit me hard. And I was curious as to how you look at modern times, and do you have any insights for people? Are you fearful of how fast technology is exponentially rising? And I think what you're doing is actually helping with Winston's warning, right? Like what you're doing as an individual and like what people at Squatch are doing. But most people, they see Chat GPT. I'm in a couple like threads of conversations online, and they're like, oh, how can I immediately use this for my business?
Mm-hmm.
Well, why don't we look at the consequences of it? I mean, it's great that we can get with a flick of a switch an even better answer than Google search engine. But how is this going to affect us, and how is AI going to affect us? And it just doesn't seem like there's any like institution that's like checking these technologies. Not to say that we don't want to stymie innovation as well, but I'm curious as to like where you see this going. And
Yeah. So, I mean, the hard part, I love technology, obviously, and I love like advances. I mean, you saw it in the NFT world too, of like how many frauds and how much these new innovations, like if technology continues to outpace the cult of, and it's going to,
yeah.
And like the problem is technology increases exponentially under, I think it's Moore's law, where morality, even at its best, is linear.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just, and the natural case of things that one is going to progress faster than the other. Now, the problem and the issue that we run into is, especially as technology increases more and more, and this is, Churchill's writing World War I, World War II era. And so we get the introduction of the atom bomb, right? And so if you think about how technology is only going to continue to give power into the hands of more and more individuals. So it's like, think about whether it's a
That's a good point. That's a good point.
You know what I mean? Like not necessarily an atom bomb, but it could be like a what am I looking for? Like a cyber, I don't know, cyber virus.
Yeah. Okay. What I was gonna say is Bitcoin as a technology, or decentralized social media, is like a technology that can actually help individuals gain a little bit more power.
100%. And that's but one of the dark sides of decentralizing power with increasing technology is if they don't have the moral depth and wisdom to wield those things, they can be used for destruction.
Mm-hmm.
And so it necessarily gets to this point where, as our ability to deliver death and destruction on a massive scale with handheld devices kind of gets better and better, if we don't similarly have a cultivated spirit and soul and sense of morality and goodness, then all we're doing is we're ensuring our own destruction. And so if what we're doing is effectively giving everybody an atom bomb and saying, hopefully we don't kill ourselves, that's a pipe dream. And so that's one thing I do worry about, is if we continue on this path without sort of doing it. At the end of the book, I get to C.S. Lewis and his, he talks about men without chests and how we've sort of, education has removed sort of the qualitative aspect of talking about the unanswerable questions of, why are we here? What does it mean to be good? Because we want to replace it with just pure subjectivity of like, live your truth, where there isn't a truth. There isn't an objective truth. There isn't something that we can all rally around. But that's the idea of natural law. And it's like, when you remove natural law, you have to understand the implications of that, because we don't get the Nuremberg trials. We don't have anything with which to convict the Nazis of war crimes. There isn't something like a transcendent ethic to convict them underneath. And so that's where it gets like, as we become more fractured and fragmented and individualized, it's good in some respects from a decentralized point of view, but in some respects we need some sort of something to unite us.
Yeah.
And it's no longer God like it used to be. It's no, you know what I mean? And so that's where we get into this really hairy situation where it gets really fragmented, and that's kind of like, 70 years ago, that's what Churchill was writing about. Was he saw the very beginning stages and was able to sort of project out the consequences of increasing technology. And now we're really in it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's something that I was like super pumped about. I was like, oh wow, we can have so much opportunity as an individual.
Yeah.
And there's this one quote from a Joe Rogan episode with one of the hosts of The Social Dilemma, the documentary.
Yeah.
And he talks about these different routes, and he does convey it within a bowling alley where like the right side is centralized AI authoritarian control. And the left side of the alley, the bunker, is just decentralized chaos. And then in the middle is like somewhere in between. So I'm curious as to like how, like what will be that defining, unifying aspect. And yeah, I think about it a lot.
All right, just because I am not a huge fan of open loops, unclosed loops.
Okay. Yeah.
When you were trying to think of that portion of the book where I imagine Socrates sort of like speaking to me or delivering a message, and I said, "Oh, I think that's Marcus Aurelius." I want to. There is the portion in the book where, so when I'm talking about Marcus Aurelius, I'm just gonna read it so I don't mess it up. One of the main ideas of the Stoics was this idea of like remember death, memento mori.
I've got this.
I love it.
Daily Stoic.
Yeah, I love it. And so, toward the end of the Marcus Aurelius section, specifically when I'm talking about considering death and how the contemplation of death should inspire you to live urgently and renew this sort of sense of perspective and purpose on the things you ought to pay attention to, what things matter and what things don't. At the end of that section, I sort of offer this experiment and I say, just because death comes for us all doesn't make death our enemy. If anything, death is our friend, who is trying to inspire us to like live great lives and live urgently. And so I come to this, and I come to the end of the section, and I say, if Marcus were here, I suspect he would suggest that death is our greatest friend. In fact, if I were allowed to put words in his mouth, perhaps he would even say something like this. And then that's when I sort of offer this section of trying to put myself in his shoes and say, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but some shy away from dwelling on death, thinking it's simply a thief that does little but steal joy from the present moment. It's something eager to snatch our life away and be kept at bay. Yet how exhausting it must be to run from what nobody can escape. Regardless of who we are, king or crook, wise or wicked, death plods along each of us, seeking our company, not to steal life, but to give it, wanting nothing more than to remind you that you are not guaranteed another moment beyond the one you are in. Perhaps death, then, is a dear friend, tears trickling down his cheeks as he watches your life like a tortured spectator, doomed to witness how you keep putting off living, desperately hoping that you'll turn your eyes toward him and be reminded to soak in this moment.
Mic drop.
That again, that's another one where it's like, the writing it, the meditative and sort of like a healing effect of writing something like that is like, it's so strange to experience. Now I have a decent amount of distance from this book. It came out like almost a year ago. And then, open to like a random page and be like, I wrote that. And then have it like, all of a sudden this flood of like emotions of like, I can remember exactly how I felt when I wrote it or why I wrote it or the mental state I was in. And it's such an interesting thing to
Yeah.
experience.
I just recently actually saw something on Instagram. I think his name's David Cohn. I could be wrong, but anyways, the message that he portrayed was that death is beautiful in his eyes. And the reason behind that is because if you knew you were going to live hundreds of thousands of years, there's so many moments in life where you're just not going to take. I mean, almost every moment you're going to take in life is going to be taken for granted because you're just like, I'm going to live such a long time, and you don't really, I don't know, you don't hyper focus on the beauty of things maybe.
Well, I don't know that like uh, it's an it's a theoretical debate that happens right now because I've had it with a few people as we talk about how far off something like immortality is, even if it's just a preservation of consciousness in some altered form. Where like I don't know if you've seen Altered Carbon or the show or
I
know the
haven't. I haven't.
premise
I know
generally.
the premise somewhat generally, but yeah, I haven't watched
Yeah,
it.
so I mean, so just briefly, the premise is that sort of your consciousness, everything you know, can be uploaded into the cloud effectively, and then downloaded into a new body
That's
when
crazy.
yours decays
Yeah.
and dies.
Yeah.
And so it's a different type of immortality. It's not, the preservation of the body. Laws of entropy. We don't know how to get around the fact that our cells lose the ability to replicate themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why we age. We haven't been able to solve that. And so then it's like, okay, I don't think we're that far away, like it or not,
Mm-hmm.
from a situation where somebody would be able to be replicated through sort of like a re-downloading of their knowledge or consciousness or awareness. This is like Elon's got Neuralink, and there's sort of like all those various things, right? And so there's a very large moral, theoretical, academic, all of those things. There's a very, this goes back to Churchill's
Mm-hmm.
sort of like the pace of technology. There needs to be a lot, like a significant public discourse around whether what we're getting ourselves into and whether this is something we want to do and what are the implications of this. And the reality is I don't think we can stop it regardless. I think some sort of immortality is coming, whether it's just consciousness, or something else. And right now we'll speculate about what that means and what the implications are. But it's gonna get interesting because yeah, go ahead.
To me, I feel like if you have immortality with your consciousness and you can just replicate bodies like from a conveyor belt, there'd be infinite war, fighting for resources. Don't you think?
Well, so that's where it gets. I mean, it goes back to your point of my instinct says that beauty is gone entirely.
Yeah.
Like that this really gets to what C.S. Lewis was talking about in Abolition of Man, in terms of the world no longer has a qualitative aspect. It's not beauty, truth, goodness. It's all just, how do I preserve this thing? It's all just, it's all power.
Yeah.
It's all power. And that's where it gets, I don't know, not a world I really want to live in, to be honest. It's like I'll take a world where I die if that means I get to keep beauty.
Yeah, same. I mean, here in Austin, in the Squatch realm, but just like in this region of United States, a lot of people are very focused on improving their health. And what I see, there's wellness centers, and it's great to see the evolution of better ways of taking care, or just healthcare, better paths of healthcare around the world.
Yeah.
But yeah, once we're definitely already getting to a point. I've seen certain people on Instagram. I'm trying to remember his name. He was a doctor, but he was just like, I firmly believe I will live till 142. And he says that like with conviction because it's his living to optimize health. And so he thinks that I'm wondering too, if you have that mindset all the time, you're just constantly, and this is with Brian, I think his name's Brian Johnson too. Like he's just taking he's hyper analyzing his life and measuring everything that he's doing, consuming. And I just don't know how I feel about that. Obviously you want to be intentional with your health like we all are, but to an extent that's just so extreme. It's just like, are you enjoying life? You know?
Well, yeah, I mean, so it gets into this question of like, who is your God? What are you worshiping? You know what I mean? Like, because fundamentally, you have to answer the question of what's the purpose of life. And when you start to get into this quest for immortality, there's a humanism aspect to that, of where it's like this it just gets so strange so quickly, because like you can't talk about it without talking about everything and like unraveling all of the questions of the universe and why we're here and why, like, what we're supposed to be doing. And I mean, to me, it's like, my question is always, what's the point of living forever? Like, why?
I mean, some people might love the pursuit of knowledge, just constantly learning about the world.
Yeah. So
like the romance of reality is a cool book too. Like certain parts of the universe that we just don't understand. So if someone's just so purely fascinated by knowledge of our universe and they're just constantly chasing that, I could see that being a reason why.
Yeah. And that's an admirable thing to be attracted to. Now, it goes back to this idea, like, you know, how deceptive we are as human beings, self-deceptive. I don't know who the quote is attributed to, but it's the idea that progress happens one death at a time. And so if you just think about it in your own life, like human beings, some of the ideas and some of the progress we made are kind of just a function that old ideas die with humans. And so we also tend as human beings, as we get older, our mindsets become more rigid. When we're younger, they're a little more like fluid and malleable. And then as we age, we get set in our ways. And so what's to prevent just basically us indoctrinating ourselves deeper and deeper in our ideas if we live forever?
What first comes to mind is, you know, marijuana has federally become legal. Psilocybin may become federally acceptable or just universally, globally acceptable. Ayahuasca, different types of consciousness massaging substances. And what if this was just the beginning of being able to maintain that childlike brain? And then if you truly could live an immortal life forever, and you had these tools to be able to keep your neurochemical balance or just the way that your brain is constructed to an extent that you're constantly fluid like a child, that's a cause for wanting to live forever, because you have that. I don't know, that's the first thing that comes to my mind.
Maybe.
That'd be nuts.
Maybe.
To take a turn to a different topic, something that's driven me to really appreciate being at Squatch specifically is not just taking care of my physical health, mental, and having a community, but also to have just to have deeper connections. And I think that's part of the purpose of this podcast for me. And I'm aiming in this direction, right? It seems like it's a good calling for me. And you were at the first Meta Men, and this was something that I kind of got off my chest. But what got me here to Squatch and moving to Austin was a time in my life where I think you quoted in a podcast, the acceleration of pain breaks inertia and changes your actions. And that's definitely, I totally reciprocate that clearly. A part of me for a long period of time was in these pre-programmed habits of not taking care of my body, over consuming alcohol, weed, other stuff. And kind of that just reverberates outwards towards everything, your relationships and whatnot. Relationships are super important. And so it seems like to me, you've inserted, based off of where I'm at in the book, I'm almost like 3/4 or more. You've inserted a few points in your life that have been painful, but this pain has made you who you are, right? Like at least to me, some of the most painful moments in my life are what has really broken that. You know, it's caused this acceleration, in momentum to act. And so I was wondering if you could dive into maybe some of the more challenging aspects that you've faced in your life and what really has driven you to be one of the founders or
Yeah.
owners of
Owners. Yeah, yeah.
Squatch, and you're doing you're a startup lawyer still, as well as you're doing a few side entrepreneurial
Yeah.
paths. So I was wondering if you could kind of maybe, I think it resonates with a lot of people in society to hear and empathize with people's painful moments. And it's really cool that you're able to discuss that too. It shows that you have courage to be vulnerable. So I was wondering if you could share that.
Yeah. I mean, I think the specific one I kind of go into in the book of one of probably the largest tipping point for me, um, in terms of even like moving to Austin and just I was on a very sort of linear path for my life in terms of I I, I was a third year at a law firm. It kind of been following like a very structured way of being. You go to college, play football, and it's like, okay, go to law school, get a job out of law school. Then it's like you have the vision of the white picket fence, and like, okay, it's like next you acquire a wife, and then I acquire a house, and then I build a fence, and then I have a dog, and then I retire at 65. And so I everything was going according to that plan. Everything was going smooth. It was going great. Now, it was only illusory, the feeling that it was going great, because like below the surface, there's sort of this erosion of the soul that happens in the spirit. Now, this is my favorite fiction book of all time is Dante's Divine Comedy, and I start out in my book that's talking about Dante's. He starts his Inferno with midway along life's journey, I found myself in the dark forest, for the straightforward path had been lost. Now, that sounds a lot like the midlife crisis that everybody faces at one point, when all of the sudden something in life happens, and then everything you've done, every decision you've made up to that point, you start to question whether you chose this life for yourself, or whether you believe certain things, or simply just, inherited a script from your parents that you'd been living out. And so all of a sudden everything's up for grabs. It's for me, that moment came after a breakup that absolutely tore me apart. And it was like a day. I only dated this girl for a brief but intense period, and is what how I think I reference it in the book, and that's very true. I think the reason it was so hard for me was because when I remember when I met her, it was the first time in my life where suddenly something was more important to me than my career, than like this linear path I was on. And so I had sort of like displaced all of my identity and everything that I'd come to like love and my attention, that had served me very well to, graduated second in my law school class, was at the largest firm in Minneapolis. And so by all objective metrics, I was doing great. And like I had a skill set that allowed me to do that. And Then I met this girl and like absolutely fell in love. Was convinced I was gonna spend the rest of my, I was like, this is it. Like this is what life is about.
Mm-hmm.
Like and so all of a sudden, like if you think about it in terms of like planets or whatever, um, it's like I had been, all of my energy had been going towards career success. And then I met this girl and it was like, oh, uh, actually, this seems to be what life is about, not this
Mm-hmm.
linear plan. And so it just wholesale all of my energy, attention, uh, value of life gets put into this relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Now that is there's another lesson here where the other force outside of pain that can pull you from inertia is love. And this is the idea. This is another. I'm gonna go back to Dante's Divine Comedy again. One of my favorite parts of Dante's Divine Comedy comes at the end of the second part, which is Purgatorio, before he goes into Paradiso, so paradise. So it goes. It's basically hell, purgatory, paradise. So after he scales Mount Purgatorio, there's different levels, terraces in Mount Purgatorio. At the end of it, there's a wall of fire. And he has to pass through this wall of fire to get to paradise. That's the final fire that burns off sin, purges souls so they can enter paradise. And he's scared of the fire. He doesn't want to enter it. The only thing that makes him enter it is the fact Virgil, he's a Roman poet, who's Dante's guide, says, hey, on the other side of this fire is Beatrice. Beatrice is waiting for you. And Beatrice is like the woman he loved in life, who is now representative of the pure soul, kind of like God. She's united with God. So Virgil has to tell him, like, hey, the thing you love most is on the other side of these flames. And so that was the first instance for me. It's like, for all of the pain that relationship would cause me later, at first, that is ultimately the thing that pulled me from this linear path of destruction.
Mm.
And so even though there's a lot of pain associated with it, I now have the distance to look back and be like, it's still the best, like probably the best thing that could have happened to me, because that was the only force strong enough to get me out of this situation that was making me miserable without me even realizing it.
So you think you would have stayed
I do.
on the path of being a lawyer?
And you know, it's hard, right? Like I'm going to go back to what I talked about earlier. I don't know to what extent it's me justifying, like self-justifying this path, and like trying to find a way for it to make sense of why did this happen. It could be that, but I at least have a story that makes sense in my head and is one of empowerment and one where all things are working together for good. And so I've since been able to see like, oh, that pulled me from this path. And then what happened was this relationship disintegrated. It was the one that had pulled me from that path. And all of a sudden I was in free floating space where I was like, didn't really have a direction. No longer was like, I didn't know what to do. And what I realized in that spot was like how little up to that point in my life of what I'll call like soul serving things I was participating in, like things that would make me, gave me in like inner value, like saw no longer needed validation. I wasn't really doing anything in my life at that point where I could be satisfied with myself, where I could do it. And if I did it, then it was like, one of my favorite lines in there is the steel soul is always satisfied with itself. And what I realized at that point in my life after the career and then the relationship was, it's like, oh, this goes back to Oasyss of, oh, wait a second. I've structured my life to where it's all of these external things I'm chasing that I think have value. Those are the things that give me value, is like these external things that I'm chasing. And if you take them away, then there's nothing actually here of value. So I'm going to keep putting on the show and the illusion on stage of like, I'm chasing these things that I think are going to fill me up. But ultimately I'm going to bring my empty self with me wherever I go.
Yeah.
And so finally all of that got stripped away, and that's the pain. Like that's painful. Like that's like the painful sort of like, whether you call it burning dead wood, as Jordan Peterson would say, or just like just when everything gets stripped away. That's the moment of Boethius in prison in Constellation Philosophy. Everything is stripped away. What you're left with is yourself, like your capital S self, and that's vulnerable, and you feel naked. But it's also sort of like the rock bottom point that you can start to be like, okay, how does if myself was calling the shots, how would we do this thing? How do we structure this thing? What are the things that I can start to do where I don't need external validation? Like, and so for me, that was writing, that was building a gym. It was, I started a podcast with a buddy up in Minneapolis and started talking about philosophy. And he was like, what are the things that actually like allow me to find internal value and happiness, to where I just get out of this loop of allowing external forces to determine the direction of my life and how I'm spending my days.
Yeah. That is something that's very challenging nowadays. I would say, especially for me, I'm still to this day battling that external validation, external success. And I had kind of a slightly similar scenario of where I left a relationship. So I chose to leave.
Yeah.
But part of this kind of happened, and I was expressing this to Michelle, our friend here in the studio, in one of the last episodes, is I was guided by external substances. So alcohol or weed, or do I have a good job? Do I have a beautiful girlfriend?
Yeah.
And I found Tim Ferriss, and I just it was like a new world opened up. I bought his book, Tools of Titans. I listened to so many episodes. I started to meditate. I started to read, and just like crazy. And in the midst of finding all of that and changing my habits, I was still working for this job with this girlfriend. And I was like, oh man, what's led me up to here does not feel like it's been a soul-driven, internal, intentional steps leading up to it. And everything felt like, oh my God, like I kind of have, this is what it felt like at the time. I don't know if it's smart, like looking back in retrospect, like if it was smart, but I dropped everything. To me, everything was just being with this girl I was with for 2+ years. This job I had for 4 years, and ended up moving back home with my parents for like half a year. And it felt pretty demoralizing doing it. I made the decision, like this girl was willing to be with me, and the job that I had, they were like, why are you leaving? Don't leave. And I still did it because I did feel, and maybe it was the quarter life crisis, not half, but quarter. I had turned 25, and I really questioned everything about where I was. And when I went back home, I was able to have time off to be able to just reflect on my past and understand my biggest fears, some of the traumas that I went through, and really just kind of journal and think and just do nothing.
Yeah.
And so I would say still to this day, I'm not perfect. No human being is, but I still to this day, I'll chase, or I'll constantly question, am I doing this for external validation from others?
Mm-hmm.
This podcast, the reason why it took me so long was because I was questioning my motives constantly. I was like, am I doing this because status? I want to be better than Joe Rogan. No, that's I know that will lead to disappointment. It could lead to, who knows, but that's kind of, I'm doubting myself here, but I just questioned everything. And so I think that's super difficult. And it does, I think, I don't write as nearly as much as you, but I do write, I like just free flow. Also, like a 5-minute journal, gratitude, and all that stuff. But I think writing more and more and more is like really required, especially to this day, because living specifically in the US, like it's so easy. Like we live in the world of Alexandria, where every point of information book is a click away from being delivered to our house. And then we also have Amazon to deliver other things, whether it's food products, anything we want. It's kind of amazing. And it's so easy for people to get caught up in these external distractions and not really dig into your soul. And like me and Yash had a conversation in the last episode, like just we've never had a spiritual evaluation. And I think a part of me recently has been trying to do that. And so like Squatch mentally and physically has kind of been forming, like getting out of my head, like, cause I've been in pretty difficult places, like emotionally, mentally, and Squatch, like moving to Austin, moving to Austin and getting a job that I felt really was aligned with my beliefs was a good first start. But then I also felt like I still need some kind of foundation that's going to set my mind right and put me in this path that feels right in regards to aligning with my soul, even if I don't have any fucking clue what that means.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, your book has been helpful in regards to trying to get, because I'm starting that.
Yeah. And maybe we'll end the conversation with this, just because it's a powerful way to end things in terms of, it's something that I've tried to implement, and this speaks to your point of, I think, speaking of Tim Ferriss, I think I first heard this on Tim Ferriss. I think it's Derek Sivers, because you know how Tim Ferriss asks a question, same question at the end of every podcast, if you could put something on a billboard, and Derek Sivers, I think it's him, I hope it's him, says it won't make you happy. And so that sentence is something I think is so important to carry with you in every endeavor and consult occasionally in every new thing that you go. Is you start with the understanding, you constantly test the things you're wanting to do against this statement, it won't make you happy. Start there and then build from there. It's like this podcast, right? It won't make you happy. Writing, it won't make me happy. Building this gym, it won't make me happy. The thing that's going to make me happy is if I can look myself in the mirror and say that I am doing my best to fundamentally, I think the purpose of life is to, Nietzsche has like, be yourself. Kierkegaard thought the same thing. And there's this idea of like expressing authentically expressing ourselves as much as possible. And whatever that looks like, whatever medium that looks like. And so that is like, for me, it's writing. It's not going to make me happy, but it is the one thing where I can rest satisfied, where for all of life's suffering and for all of the things, like this is the thing where I'll at least be able to sleep with myself at night, knowing that this thing that I could feel trying to get out of me, I'm releasing it into the world. And so I'm not under the illusion that like it's going to make me, I think happiness is such a loaded term nowadays of and it means different things to different people. But we all use it as if it means the same thing to each one of us. But its identity is so individual. And so this idea of like testing everything you're chasing against the statement and understanding that anything external won't make you happy. It has to start from sort of this like, the soul's dream is the life's purpose. There's this guy named Michael Meade that says that. And fundamentally, that's the only thing I think in life that will leave you feeling fulfilled is if your soul is satisfied. And the only way to satisfy your soul is for whatever it wants to express, like that unique thing, that unique voice that is the seed of your unique experiences, beliefs, the things you've seen, the things you've done, the things you're good at, like your gifts, if that is cultivated in some way, shape, or form and released into the world, like that is the only thing
Mm.
at the end of the day that like is going to leave you. Everything else is going to leave you empty.
Yeah.
And so it's like starting everything that way of understanding, like setting your expectations. I guess ultimately is what you're doing is you're understanding that like, hey, this won't make me happy. Would I still do it?
Mm.
Even like understanding that it's not gonna fulfill me because that's something I have like it has to be found internally.
Yeah.
Like it might be a way for me to express my individuality, but at the end of the day, if you understand it won't make you happy, then you record a podcast and you do it, right? And it gets 0 views and you're still okay with that. Like it's when you so writing is a good instance for me. If I write something and it doesn't, nobody likes it or it doesn't get read, whatever. Nobody buys the book. But the fact that I just got it out there, like I can feel really good about it. Now, if I went into it with expectation of like, oh, this thing is going to make me happy. So I'm going to like, then all of a sudden my worth is in the hands of how it gets received by all of these things. I'm not doing it for the thing in itself. I'm not writing just to write. I'm now seeking something. I'm seeking happiness. I'm seeking happiness through it in the form of like the validation I would receive. And so I for me, it's a hard concept to talk about and try to explain. But I think it's important as something just like carry with you. The only way to sort of avoid the trap of, are you doing this for the right purposes, is to just constantly remind yourself like, hey, let's just dispel illusion now. It's not going to make you happy. Do you still want to do it? If the answer is yes, that might just because that's your soul's way of expressing itself.
So it's essentially, do you enjoy the process? But it sounds like you don't. We were just talking in the beginning of this. You don't totally enjoy the process of writing, but it's the release, or is it a combination?
I hate it and I love it, right? Because this is a weird feature of life is that what's experienced as a low is remembered as a high. So what's experienced as like misery in like this terrible process, suffering of writing, of just like totally agonizing, gets remembered as the most precious parts of my life, most precious moments. And so it's this weird function of like the lows or the highs, actually. But that only happens if you love the process. Like if you're able to sort of look back at it and be like, man, there's a intense period of like growing pain that happened in that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something to definitely take away. On that note, Noah, thanks for your message. I think you just said that it's really hard to describe and talk about this process for each individual person to authentically express themselves and find their soul in a certain way. But you're doing it in a really, I think, efficient way. And so thank you for doing what you're doing, for writing your book, being a leader here at Squatch. I appreciate you.
I appreciate that. And I would like if I could try to distill my ramblings of like the hanging over, it won't make you happy for takeaway for people listening to this podcast. If you're somebody that's struggled to find what your outlet is, or the type of like, you feel yourself, you're like, there's something I want to do, but I don't really know. It's like, okay, well, just ask yourself, if nobody read this thing, if nobody liked it, like if the only person that ever saw this thing was you, would you still do it? And for me, writing was that answer.
Mhm.
It was like, it just felt like I needed to.
Mhm.
It felt like there was something in me that like needed to do it,
Mhm.
regardless of, yes, I would love people to read it. And like, yes, I'm going to spread my message and try to like, because I think it's of value. But at the end of the day, like, the reward is the work. It goes back to that same idea
Mhm.
of like, it won't make you happy. The work is what's going to make you happy. Maybe that's actually a really good way of distilling what
Yeah.
I'm trying to say is it's like, choose your endeavors based on the work and whether the work will make you happy, not the reward. Because you can control the work. You can control your input. You can control your effort. You can't control the outcome and the result.
Mhm.
And so by placing your happiness conditionally on the outcome or result, you're setting yourself up for failure.
Well said. On that note,
I'm about to pee my pants.
same. All right, everybody. Thanks for listening. Peace out.
Peace.